I do not have Claudio's slide deck. Where do I in the old chat? Maybe I do. Let's see. I do not, so I'm just gonna talk and wing it. Um, so welcome to the virtual brown bag. I know Claudia's going to be here in a bit. It sounds like we've got a couple people who don't normally get to join us here. That's awesome. Um, what is virtual brown bag? It is our weekly developers show and tell. Basically, anything you've been working on, thinking about, want to argue about, want to float, just talk with other developers. We've covered all sorts of stuff. I mean, we've been running this on and off for like 12, 13 years. So everything from .NET to, I'm always talking about Emacs to JavaScript to various specifics of TypeScript, Docker. We've done it all. We're happy to do it again. If you're sharing your screen, be careful. Don't share anything that is going to be a problem to your employer, or that's going to cause us to have to go back and edit the video. That's a big pain in the ass, and we probably won't want to do it. So make sure you're thinking about that. We do record these. We do put them up on YouTube for people to kind of to watch. Sometimes people even watch the old ones. So, that being said, we've got three people on. I know we've got Claudio, who's going to join in a bit. How's everyone doing? What's going on? What are y'all working on? What are y'all thinking about? What we got?
Yeah. I've been job hunting, so that's what I've been working on.
Yeah. How's that going? How are you finding the job market?
I think it's still very much the world of hey, let's talk, and it turns out no, like this isn't a good fit.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've had 4 initial discussions this week, and like 1 was something I wanted to move forward with.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's always rough, and it's always annoying, isn't it? I always kind of feel bad for that. I mean, I just went through that recently. It's a whole process every darn time. Let's see. Anything in particular that's on your mind with that process that you want to bring up or talk about, ask questions about?
I guess like the most common reason from like I don't think this will work out is like they're like, hey, we're this cool, exciting company that does all these things, and then after talking like 5 minutes, I realized what you want me to do is show up and start working on this long list of tickets you have, and it's like I'm not interested. I think a lot of places are very, very interested in hiring smart people and then telling them what to do, and I think it's not a smart plan.
No, that's true. But I think part of that is, so I've said this a lot of times, and part of the issue is that like a lot of places have a big mess on their hands. Very few places, relatively speaking, have kind of their shit together. So they need stuff fixed, and then also someone to come in that'll help them figure out the way that they should be doing stuff. And it's hard to get to point 2 without going to point 1 first, right? So I could see I can see why they want tickets work, is we got to provide business value in the meantime. But yeah, that's usually the motivation. That and just kind of like not thinking through roles, because that's really, really hard to do. Right.
Yeah, my personal favorite was talking to a VPE at a startup, and about halfway through the call, I just like straight out asked him, was like, so this code base, was it written by anyone who currently works here? And the answer was no.
Yeah. That's fine.
It's fine. Never.
Yeah, honestly, I find there's plenty of times when stuff. Like I actually am getting to the point where I don't really mind working on a messy, terrible code base because I've been through that cycle enough. I'm like, yeah, it's fine. We'll fix it. It'll take a year or something like that, but it'll be much better in a year. Uh, but yeah, that's always hard. But if you limit yourself to only places that aren't that, then man, that's hard too.
Yeah, I don't mind a messy code base. It's just like big question in my mind is like I've done this a million times before. If I show up and say, "Hey, here's what we need to do, A, B, C, D," is anyone going to listen to me?
Well, no. Why would they off the bat?
Yeah, it's like why?
Yeah, that's all about building trust. That takes a while. But yeah, agreed. All right. What about the rest of the group? What have people been working on, playing with?
I've been doing a lot of Elixir the
I was
last.
just about to ask you. Yeah, tell us about it.
I don't know. I also have stuff that like tangentially relates to what what's you were previously speaking. What's your name? Sorry, I'm
I think that was Randall.
Randall. What Randall was saying, because we hired a very smart person, and he does not at all get along with our director of engineering. Like not at all. And in part, our director of engineering like is kind of an old school open source guy. He has like a lot of he sort of has opinions that are product, but he also has things where he's like literally he came over like the guy we hired was a senior engineer, was meant to lead a project. I didn't agree with like all the decisions, but it's like I get it. He has some like hipster ideas about how to do things. I as the person, I'm like, you know what? If I disagree with him, I'll just do it because it's easier for me to just do a thing that someone, even if I kind of disagree with it. But in general, I agreed with him, and I thought that he was bright. He brought a lot of good ideas. He knew a lot about functional programming. He knew a lot about system design and stuff. And so, and I was fine. But the person sort of who he reports to is this guy who has extremely strong ideas about like not just what to do, but kind of how to do it. So he showed up like on Monday a couple weeks ago and said he was doing a reset on our project because I guess he wasn't sort of happy with how it was going. A lot of the reason the project was taking a long time was because he had sort of changed his mind a bunch of times about what the biggest priority is. Like at first it was like, okay, we just need to get a bunch of SDKs out to customers in different languages. But there's some caveats. We can't actually, we need all of the SDKs have to encapsulate a whole bunch of business logic because they were going to represent what he wanted to do for the version 2 of the API, which essentially meant that every SDK in every language had to have all of this, extra tests and had to know a lot about sort of how the platform was, and we argued that this was actually like we need either some second version of this, right? Like some transformation layer that so that all the SDKs can just basically connect to a single sort of gateway, and they don't all have to sort of have the same knowledge about like because there would be moments when it was like, okay, so to create this class or whatever, you're gonna have to make 3 API calls, and it's like, okay, that's like fine if we're just like doing one SDK and we're just messing around, but like when you're talking about like let's do this in Java and let's do this in C# and let's do this, and it's like then the debt grows and then it becomes super hard to iterate. And so just getting him to sort of get on that train was like a big thing. But I mean, it just speaks to the point where it was like I'm more like I am fine just like working on tickets. But if I actually had to think about the big picture, which is like the act of creating like 8 or 9 SDKs that like all sort of have basically all have to have gross amounts of business logic and all of this other stuff, and keeping them in sync, and then having them open sourced, and then having the issues where there's bugs in one SDK but not another, and there's like a big reason why pretty much every company that is like ours like has some very largest generation step and makes their SDKs kind of as dumb as possible. Like if I had to actually think about like what it's like to work on this project long term, I'd be like, yeah, I don't want to lead it if this is like the direction that we're sort of being forced to go in. So in any case, like it's a question of like everyone, all of us wanting to like basically we all want to sort of create this amazing developer experience, but like just the kind of and you have these two people who are both like sort of more senior than me fighting about it, and it's like I feel like you guys agree with the direction, but one really wants to be more prescriptive, and so it's like you're scaring you're it's like even though the person agrees with you on principle, you end up like so this guy is basically like so you end up basically scaring good people away from your organization by being overly prescriptive, and so it's like I don't mind yeah. So just to relate, messy code bases like that's okay, but there's also a way, and if they accept like that, oh, these are priorities, that's great, but then like if they if they also say this is actually how we want you to address, like they're like it's messy, but we also insist that you migrate to this other thing that you disagree with. It's like, okay, so then you're basically like hiring smart people, but then telling them exactly what to do, kind of like what Randall said. And that's like such a sort of a waste of talent. But it also is like really, I think, offends people who, especially because at a high level, like you've got people, everyone has egos. You have people who like spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff. And so to go to a company as a senior person and then be told sort of how to do something by someone who you don't necessarily think is smarter than you is, I think, a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, especially in my case, I'm a UI engineer, and so there's a lot of like a thing that's happened multiple times in my career. It's like a bunch of backend devs put together a service and say, "Hey, this is cool, but the front end is garbage because we're not front end developers. So we'll hire Randall on as our UI engineer because he's been doing UI for ages." And then I'll show up and I'll say, "Okay, I'm going to start doing UI." And they're like, "Okay, here's like you say, like let me, the person who doesn't do this sort of work, tell you, the person who's been doing it for years, exactly how to implement it." And that's just like a recipe for disaster because it's it's the decisions aren't where the knowledge is.
Yeah, totally. It's like it's that weird hybrid role of like product people who also want like where your product person is like a developer. I think it's like important to kind of create a contract between like teams where it's like clear, it's like because it's very easy as a product person who is like comes from a development background to like mix the thing where he like becomes just as opinionated about like the how as the why or the what, and then like
Mm-hmm.
it's really yeah, that's a recipe for like a lot of micromanagement and yeah, just like unhappy people underneath you because you don't that person who's in that role doesn't also have the time to even like properly manage the project or properly like like if that person cares so much about this framework, right, or whatever, like you're a UI engineer, something like this, and there's something in this framework that hasn't been solved. Let's say this person is super into, I'll just say like Elixir Live View or whatever, and there's something in it where you're like, sorry, we don't have, there's no way to like statically generate this thing that you, and that's a thing that you're requiring. That's a business requirement, but you've forced us down this road, but you also like don't have the time to like create that feature and add it to the ecosystem. So you're just sort of forcing someone into this uncomfortable place, but you're not like actually giving them, you're not sort of owning you're not actually ever owning your decisions, right? Or feeling the pain that maybe the person you're delegating to is feeling. And so it's like, I guess it's important for someone who is actually in that, if you're going to tell someone how to do a thing, you also actually need to be in like, I think, roll up your sleeves and like do it as well, or at least be in the weeds enough so you don't like.
Yeah.
That's what we used to call, I mean, still call the non-coding architect role, right?
Mm-hmm.
The non-coding architect, which is mostly an anti-pattern. I think there's probably ways to do it right, but like not the way that hardly anyone does it.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that I'll push back on a little something though. because this idea, like, okay, you're hiring someone really smart and you're kind of not letting them do the job. Well, when you hire someone who's really smart, usually not to come in and just start telling you what to do right away, right? You're hiring someone really smart because you think they're really smart and can help grow your organization in a right direction. Well, the key word there is grow, right? You don't tell the tree to, to grow that way and it just does it, right? You have to invest into building a relationship, building trust, and creating the conditions by which everyone agrees and has buy-in into the direction you would like to push it, and then obviously have flexibility when it's not going that direction. But even then, like, I think it's kind of a bit of a naive expectation to expect someone even very senior that they can come in, just start making calls about stuff, the way stuff should work, and everyone goes, yeah, all right. Like, even if everyone else is much more junior, like, that's just not how people work. Like, how many situations in people's career has anyone here ever had a situation in their career where it just went down like that?
I mean, I've definitely had places where people showed up and started giving orders, but I think there's a huge gulf between, if you hire an expert, you say, hey, we need an expert in this area. If you hire that expert and the expert starts working with everyone, that's great. But if you hire that expert and then you say, all right, expert, here's like ticket level instructions on what to do, it's like, no, it's the inverse of that problem where, if the expert shows up and just starts giving orders, that's not good. If the expert shows up and you start giving them orders, that's not good. It's about, software is a team sport. It's about collaboration, and that goes both ways.
Yeah, though I
think that's great.
It's fair to go through an onboarding and a trust building phase that could reasonably be several months, right? That's not unfair. Like, you still have to learn the business. You have to do stuff where we're not really expecting you to provide value. We're expecting you to get your hands in the code and, get comfortable with our workflows and stuff like that.
I guess, let's assume that person is not a natural asshole. Like, let's assume that person doesn't just show up and start barking orders.
Right.
Like, let's assume that it's been a couple months already, right? Like, that person is kind of, because I've also noticed that most companies they'll wait to deluge you with, if there's an expectation that you'll be micromanaged, they don't that doesn't just happen immediately. It's it takes a while for that to actually be for that protocol or for that to, I think, become apparent, right?
They let it stay shiny for a little while.
Yeah, I think that, so let's assume it's really just about kind of the sort of the relationship between sort of this person who you're described as kind of the non-coding architect, right? Kind of, but who's also sort of the product person and a senior person. And if that non-coding architect is doing a lot of prescribing, it's problematic because number one, you end up with, especially in situations with a lot of messy code, you're wait, so you guys screwed up and now you was there any accountability here? I mean, there are definitely companies where I've come up and all the people have been fired, and I'm wait a second. So the one person who was responsible for all this stuff is actually still here. And so it's it actually doesn't.
People don't learn lessons. What are you talking about?
Yeah. Hey, I figured I'd jump in and introduce. I've been just kind of sitting here in mute because I'm driving and my kids are in the car, so I don't know when they're going to pipe up and scream. This is a great conversation, actually. In the scenario, I recently started at a company a little over a year and a half ago, and we're a payment processing company. There's essentially two of us that are developing, and we're in 39 states processing hundreds of thousands of transactions for millions of dollars, and we're at this expanding point. And I'm very much in this position of, okay, I need a high-level person to kind of come be my number two and learn the business, learn the software, and there's very much an expectation that I'm going to give them one of our core pillars at some point and say, hey, now run with this, keep me in the loop of it. And, you know, we have a couple juniors and stuff and like mentor them. But like just hearing a lot of the perceptions about how those kind of people are introduced into the company is pretty great and pretty relevant for me right now. So that's pretty great. I think to your point, George, I totally agree. Like you have to come in and build that rapport before you actually come in and people like really want to listen to the things that you're saying. I had a company I worked for where we had a new COO that came in, and I mean, at the end of the day, he was pretty much where the end of all decisions stopped. But I kind of watched him come in, and he spent like the first 6 weeks really not implementing anything new, just going around to the different teams and the different people and just kind of communicating and kind of figuring out how they do things. And that really softened the blow when he actually started implementing a lot of like the policies and changes that he was originally brought in to do. And, you know, you kind of had a little bit more respect for him since he came in, was personable, and kind of showed that kind of, that, I guess, even that care to learn about the organization and the problems before he started making these policies that were very much different than the current way the business was operating.
Yeah. So, I mean, we talked about note-taking a lot and how, like, we're big fans of note-taking. That is such a powerful technique right there, because what ends up happening, if you're, like, take a lot of notes and you're always, like, the note-taker person, then that becomes a way of building rapport, because what happens is, like, as conversations happen, people are like, oh, I think you have saying something about that. You can usually jump into your notes and find it and link them right to it and be like, yeah, it was right here. And this is what we were talking about, this right here. And be able to like refer to your notes. And you very, very quickly become a respected person just from the fact that you have all the connections to all the stuff that were talked about that you were involved. Like just that simple thing becomes such a great technique for building rapport. And as technical people, we have a couple other venues, such as like code reviews, such as, you know, putting in bug tickets in your own software, right? When you like just you're new at the company, you're clicking around and okay, I'm just gonna put in bug tickets because I see something that's a bug or an accessibility issue or a security issue. We have those options, and those can be very good ways to build up that credibility super, super quickly, like weeks instead of, you know, months or years, which is like someone like a COO, someone who works at that level, it takes a while. Like no one's going to trust you right away. Yeah. Kids yelling in the background.
Yeah, nailed it.
So I have a couple of things to say about this.
Awesome.
So one of the things that I'm hearing, and I came in a little late, but it is very common for people in our profession to want to meet their need for mastery in our job. That is, the ability to demonstrate that you know what you're doing and you can solve problems and things like that is a fundamental human need. And a lot of people in our industry, like naturally, have, you know, try to get that need met through their job, which is, you know, perfectly fine. When that's what your need, when that's the need you're trying to meet for yourself, and you go into a situation like it was described where, you know, somebody's micromanaging you, it gets frustrating really fast, right? And so one of the things that, and I've been in situations like this where it's like, dude, I've been doing this a while. Like, I really don't need, the training wheels here. You really have to try to figure out what's going on in the organization or the person you're dealing with that's causing this sort of thing, because there's always a cause. And the most common one I've run into is an organization where there's fear rather than trust driving people's actions. Micromanagement is almost, well, I don't say it's always, it is frequently a response to people who are afraid of making the wrong decision. And that's very common in corporations in the US. So, at some level, you just have to learn how to, deal with it. And, um, it can be frustrating at times. Um,
I think
go ahead.
I think that's spot on. It really is. And in this position where I'm kind of leading the tech for a company where, for the most part, the stakes are a lot higher because we are in finance. I do take the non-micromanaging approach, but I try to be very purposeful and adamant about making my failures visible to kind of take away that fear from the people that I'm working with, so that they're not afraid of this failure, so they kind of feel empowered in kind of taking the next step. Now, at the same time, we make sure that we put guardrails in place, that the failures are certainly early and recoverable and all of these things, but making sure that you kind of give your team the right to fail to some degree certainly takes away, especially if they come from places with that micromanaging organization or structure, and where failure is seen as a terrible thing, and that's all that they kind of come in and deal with.
Yeah. So in my experience, people like to work on teams where they're given an opportunity for software developers, people in tech, to do something, right? To be in charge of a technical thing. Most software developers don't want to boss people around. That's not really their main interest, but they do like to be in control of some piece of the software, right? I mean, and you give people the opportunity to make the decisions, even when you disagree with them, even when you think they're making a mistake, bring up the issues you see. If they still think it's the right thing to do, let them do their thing. And if it blows up, take the blame yourself rather than the other person. Then you have a friend for life.
That's a good point. I mean, that's
Absolutely.
about taking the opportunity, like giving the opportunity to make decisions and being clear that I don't necessarily like agree with you on this, but I'm gonna let you make the call. Like just being clear about that, right? And so I'm interested to see, even if that. So for example, if you say like one person predicts that we will be that whatever. Let's say it's just an implementation detail. Let's say it's something like I think we will probably regret using JSON RPC or something. We'll probably want to use something like gRPC. But I'm going to let you make the call. You know what I mean? And and I think that's just saying that, like being like I disagree, but also like I'm letting you take responsibility for it. Like I want you to show me like I want to show me the error of my ways, right? Like I want you to prove me wrong, right? And I think that many developers will respond to that very positively and use this as an opportunity to like demonstrate, like you said, mastery. Right?
But I think especially if you are certainly senior to that person, that's where I think it is important to kind of let your own failures kind of be visible as well, so that when you tell them I disagree, they don't like go into their shell and don't, if they, as long as they have that ability when they feel strongly about their opinion to kind of continue to fight for it until they either try it or convinced otherwise that it's wrong way, but it doesn't happen out of fear that they kind of retreat back.
Yeah. Honestly, the vast majority of technical decisions we make don't matter that much. I mean, generally people don't come up with terrible ideas and defend them. It happens occasionally, but in general, I think that the amount of arguments and discussions and just straight up ego involved in differences of like one protocol over another. I mean, it just if it really is going to matter, almost everybody will realize that. Right? I mean, not everybody, but either people will know not to have an opinion. I mean, the real problem in those cases is when it's the person with the big paycheck who has the uninformed decision, uninformed opinion about something. Like, we used to make the joke, it's like, oh no, he's been reading CIO magazine again.
We're going to the cloud, everyone. We're going to the cloud, whatever that means.
Microservices.
Stop it. Microservices are the answer. I mean, we don't know what the question is, but they're the answer.
Microservices
like, nothing is the answer unless you know what the question is, George.
They're just monolithic functions as a service, okay? That's all they are.
So what you're saying is I could just have one application and just call every function a microservice? Cool.
Yeah, I'm saying
don't laugh.
draw a
I've seen
circle
people do
around
it.
7 functions and call it a microservice or a monolith. I don't know. It's all.
That's all.
I will say, I you know what? We're snarking about that, but that would be kind of an interesting topic of discussion, right? What makes something a microservice, and at what point would you say, no, come on, that's not a microservice, it's something else entirely?
I think if it can't be horizontally scaled, independently of other things, right, of other parts of the system.
That's an interesting idea. So, but you said lots of stuff can't be horizontally scaled.
Right. I mean, I guess you could say, okay, so I know it breaks down because it's like, well, if you have something that wraps a database and the database, but okay. So assuming we take out the persistent storage part, it's like, if the thing can be horizontally scaled without any other dependencies having to change, right? Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting. So I mean, like, I guess I can see where you're coming from with that. I would probably say that there's more to it. Well, I mean, there's definitely more
for sure. There's more.
For
sure, there's more to it. By the way.
Yeah.
And I'm not.
That's a good rule of thumb, right? I think that's interesting because if you're coming from, you just said you've been doing a lot of Elixir. And with Elixir, that often is the answer, but not always, right? Like a supervisor can't really be horizontally scaled without creating a whole new process tree, and which might or might not be what you need. I don't know.
So
yeah.
I want to back this question up because this is every time I get in a discussion like this, I have to ask people like, what do you mean exactly when you say what is something? Because that question is not simple. Are you talking about what is it made of? Like, what are the component parts that go into making something? Or are you talking about the purpose of something?
But right? I think that is precisely your question, right, George? Like that is what is a microservice?
But the question of what is that means different things in different contexts. It really is.
What is
it?
George, you need to explain yourself.
Go straight to DDD.
So that's why I'm flipping it. I want to say what is a microservice? I want to say what are the things you see in a code base where you're saying, come on guys, this is not a microservice. This thing that y'all keep calling microservice, right? This isn't one.
Okay, what's an example of an anti-pattern in a micro? Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah.
So I will volunteer something since you asked it that way. Mm-hmm. If it connects to 2 different databases, it's not a microservice.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. I don't care how small it is.
What if it's connected through an API layer?
Exactly. Yeah. What if my databases are behind the facade and it's all invisible?
That's interesting. That's one of the things I would have raised is like, if you're using a database to communicate between different things in a way that's not purposeful and structured, right? You're sharing state essentially, not a microservice. Which, yes, totally. that does actually bring up the interesting situation where, like, yeah, I have two services, and no, they're not directly talking to the same database, but they are talking to the same other service, which in itself is talking to the database.
Right. Yeah. I just keep going back to like bounded context and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well, I think bounded context is kind of a broader concept to a microservice. You can have several different services in the same bounded context, right? But yeah. Like microservices as a concept is a little closer to the metal.
Have you guys been talking about DDD a lot in the last few meetings?
I mean, generally, Claudio and I talk about it a lot, but I don't know that we've explicitly addressed it. Like,
This is my first meeting.
Oh,
What do we want to
I
talk
was
about?
just wondering if someone could explain to me what a bounded context is, because I'm not like I keep getting the Eric Evans book, and I've seen some videos, but I haven't like really dove into the DDD other than abusing certain DDD idioms when I want to make a point. But
yeah, all right.
That's about where I live.
Yeah, I can give the technical kind of part of the definition of bounded context. So, like, the official definition is that the domain, when you talk about it's completely coupled to the concept of ubiquitous language, to the point that nobody should talk about ubiquitous language without talking about context, right? So ubiquitous language is this idea of like, hey, we as a business have a common language that we all talk up, that we all use. We have a specific thing when we mean users, a specific thing when we mean students or whatever, and we want the software to use those same terms because then there's not as much opportunity for errors. It's easier to evolve, etc. Now, bounded context, chapter 17 of the Big Blue Book, eventually comes in and undercuts that entire idea and says, yeah, but that's not actually the case where the language is ever ubiquitous across the entire company. There's usually a context within which that language is ubiquitous. When someone uses the term user, or uses the term student, or uses the term professor, or uses the term tank, right? They mean a specific thing. But if you go and maybe like the operations people who are doing the people who are doing shipping, they mean thing when they say user. But if you go talk to like the marketing people or the sales people, they're still using the word user, but they're really talking about a very fundamentally different thing. And so the bounded context is kind of this line you draw around that stuff and saying this domain model is valid within this context. It is literally the boundaries of the domain model, and add on the concept that domain model doesn't have to represent the entire business. There are natural fault lines there. So one of the kind of the technique that the book uses to guide you into finding where are the contexts is to listen for when people are using the same term, but they mean kind of different things, right? So in a universe, in a system where you're designing to run a school, right? The registrar might be talking about students, and what they're talking about in that case is their capacity for registering for classes, right? And what they need to do to graduate, and their day-to-day schedules, right? And how that applies. If you go and talk to someone in the Brussels office, accounts receivable, they're talking about their aspects, the payment aspects. Like, okay, have they received money? So from the point, and those are very different things. From a practical code implementation point of view, you wouldn't want those to be the same damn object because when the registrar views it, they want to see all this stuff about schedule, and you probably want to load all that up front. But when accounts receivable, they don't need to see any of that, right? So if you're following basic information hiding principles, you would have to separate somehow. But it goes even deeper than that, because from an accounts receivable point of view, you might be a student once you've paid the check, once you've made your first payment. From a registrar point of view, you might not be a student until you've signed up for classes. So there's an identity aspect to it as well, right? And by defining those contexts up front, that makes it clear, and you can start. That keeps your domain model itself from becoming one big mess. Does that kind of ballpark it with understanding what we're talking about? Did I?
No, definitely.
Okay.
No, I think that's there.
Yeah.
And to that point, when you're showing someone the architecture and you're giving them the picture of that bounded context, when you say this is this, it comes with that implied, hey, in the ubiquitous the dictionary we're sharing, that's what we mean.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically like the lines are boundaries around different dictionaries where
glossaries. Yes.
data, like you have.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Right.
I mean, because ubiquitous language is that glossary, bound in context is that there. Now that's it. That's what the concept is. Now there's other things that kind of come along with it. It's like, well, okay, now if you want accounts receivable needs to talk to registrar at some point, so there needs to be like some layer, something at the boundaries that can translate concepts from one to the other, right? There are those ideas as well. But like that's really kind of getting into the implementation detail of like, well, okay, that's how it would have to work. If there's some way where you can make your hands wave your hands and some AI figures out all the mappings, and no, you don't need that. Right. But that's great. Yeah, conceptually that's still the idea.
Great, funny, quick anecdote about that. We were working with an estimating department one time, and we kept going to these meetings, and they kept talking about pagination, and we couldn't figure out why they kept caring about like the paging of something. And come to find out, there's a book where all the hours live, written by a guy named Page and Nation. And we were like, oh, okay, you are talking about where the hours for estimating are coming from. You don't care about the UI at all. Checks out now.
That's awesome. Page and Nation.
Yep. They'd be like, oh, we got a pagination. I'm like, what are you talking about,
dude? Yeah, that would do it.
And had we been handed a glossary going into that, probably would have saved us a couple meetings of confusion.
Yep. Well, and I will say, by the way, the bounded contexts are often poorly defined. By the way. And that's something that I think everyone needs to do a better job of it. Like, and it's hardly ever written down. So we also need to do a better job of that. But it's the goal. It's the start. It's one of the things that that kind of drives things into. You don't really have DDD without that. You could have a domain model without that concept, but you don't really have DDD because DDD is literally two ideas.
Yeah, to bring this back to bounded context, is this kind of is this in part, I mean, there's sort of this idea in DDD that you have this monolith, but based on your relationships, your modeling relationships, you can actually have a monolith that like represents all of these different bounded contexts. Where I think with microservices, right, so you'd have something like, in your example, you'd be like, you'd have, bursar student versus campus student or something, like a student that's where the definition of a student is really about their financial details versus the students versus their list of classes or something, right? And I'm wondering, to bring this back to microservices, does this mean that every microservice should be a bounded context? Is this the idea that, which means that at least naming things is less important, or
I would say
not related at all?
Well, I think there's some relation. Like, right, you could have, it's within a bounded context, you can have, a bounded context would be like some sort of service boundary, and inside of it, it can have microservices, right? But I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be one, because you can have microservices for all sorts of reasons, right? You can have a microservice because it's easier to deploy this sort of functionality to a Lambda function, right? Or you can have a microservice that's just sending out emails. You could also have microservices that sit outside of a bounded context that just provide infrastructure. So again, I just said email sending, but like an infrastructure component which just sits there and listens on a queue for all emails it has to send, batches them properly together, does throttling and stuff like that, and sending them out. That's not really in a bounded context. That's infrastructure that's implemented via a microservice, right? And it would still be a microservice because, in a large enough organization, you would still have a team that's dedicated to running it, and there would be a reasonable amount of logic there. It just would be infrastructure logic and not domain logic. So DDD doesn't really have a say on that. That's just one of the table stakes to play at scale. But I do think that, the concepts do jive together particularly well, because within a microservice, you definitely don't want multiple domain models that are especially contradictory. So, like, I can't think of any scenario where you would want a single microservice that includes multiple bounded contexts. But the vice versa can be true.
So would like a reasonable analysis of the statement of the monolith and the microservice he was talking about with the students, would it be reasonable to kind of assume, okay, say in your monolith you have the core student and you have the registration student, but then you want to break it apart, so you define your bounded context. Each can just have a student that have their own definition within their bounded context, and inside of that, it is completely up to you which microservices you deploy that are solely in that or shared between contexts. Right?
Yeah, I mean, like, you could do the same thing via monolith, exactly. Like, you could. You just have to make sure that anytime there's any communication between that accounts receivable side of stuff and that registrar side of stuff, that they go through layers. They don't just start linking into each other's domain models directly, right?
I have a question. Would just an API boundary be a layer? For example, like, if one is saying, I'm taking let's say it's an RPC, let's say it's an API, whatever. Let's say it says I take a student, right? And we know that student means different things, right? But because it's prefixed, right? Like, it's this whatever, its context is a registrar. Would it be okay for them to actually communicate through an API? Or are you saying that, like, there should actually be an additional, like, translation layer where it goes from, like, it actually translates this, I don't know, the student registration, the concept of a student and the concept of, like, a student query directly? I mean, maybe that doesn't make sense. They could connect to, why couldn't they connect to each other directly, I guess, through an API? Right.
So that is more finer grained than DDD gets into. So DDD refers to the concept as an anti-corruption layer, which is basically kind of the cell wall outside the bounded context that you have to go through and it maps concepts.
Right.
Whether that is an API or if you're doing a monolith, and like, you could do this exact same thing with, like, a monolith here and, like, differently named classes, and just you have a rule written down in your README that says, any communication between between campus students and Bursar students, or that entire, or any of those, between any communication between any part of the application which uses the domain model prefix with customers and the part of the domain model that uses that's prefix with Bursar, has to go through this function, right? That still would conceptually do it, right? And then there's no microservices or even an API or anything. You just have a function. But you do have a pinch point where mappings come through, right? So the idea is that, like, again, registrar has students. So they're what's a concept? So a registrar might need to get information. The accounts receivable. No, let's say registrar needs information from accounts receivable, because before a student registers for classes, they need to know whether that student's bills are paid up, right? Lots of ways you can do that with eventual consistency, messaging, blah, 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 blah. But like the simplest thing, which would not, violate the spirit of DDD, would be that you create some sort of object, or you call some function in a very specific designated place that basically acts as the facade for the accounts receivable code, right? The thing that would be the wrong thing to do is if the registrar code actually goes and starts newing up object or loading objects directly using that other domain model. That's where you cross the line and start doing wrong. So long as you're kind of going through a reasonable facade, you're still kind of sticking within the boundaries of what DDD prescribes. It's just kind of doing it in an awkward way that maybe you could do better now that microservices is a concept. Do you agree with that, Claudio?
Some mapping, some translation. Which it's clear. Microservices at least makes it harder because it's so clear that the API, like, this is maybe a side effect of the way that IO works, but it's like, so because IO, at least in a lot of languages, is so hard, and in some ways like and it's so it often, like, there's a lot of ceremony around it. And also the way that microservices work, IO, at least the boundaries around IO, have become like the natural places for where that translation happens and then anti-corruption happens. And so it's in some ways like more intuitive, but I feel like it's in some ways an accident of how languages work. Like, at least in some languages, obviously, like JavaScript, what IO generally means something like the await. So it's almost like when you're in promised land, that you kind of become conditioned that there's some kind of anti-corruption stuff that you probably want to have. In other languages, less so. But I guess what I mean is, like, because there's already this contract, and because IO has ceremony around it, I just feel like microservices maybe not explicitly, but by accident, push people to at least having that layer because of the additional ceremony around making those requests, because it's not as easy as just importing a domain or whatever.
You can't take JavaScript code and then start, like, you do have to remember, like, this does come from like Java and like, right, the age of Java, and
right. I was just pointing out,
but yes, you can't take JavaScript and like link directly into backend code and doing stuff. But I mean, like, there's lots of stuff you can do which would not violate the premise, right? Like, let's say, for practical reasons, you still need to communicate. You need to communicate which students are up to date or not, right? So what would be wrong would be for the registrar to do a query into tables owned by the Broussard domain model and to the accounts receivable domain model and start picking values out of there. What would be okay would be for the accounts receivable model to have a table used specifically for interchanging data with others, which just has like a user ID and whether they're paid up or not, that it updates, and tell others, you know what, it's fine to query into that table. Like, that would be okay, right? You're not so microservices kind of shuts down the possibilities because you are kind of splitting things in different services that have to do IO, but the concept is broader, right?
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, that example you gave, I just was like, wow, what a nightmare of having to not code review, but also do database design and make sure that it's like, sure, where you have to police both the code boundaries, but then also the database schema itself to make sure that nobody's doing it. And it's like microservices, because they're hard in some ways, make it, it's like, oh God, like, oh, this only connects to one database, and so I don't have to worry about someone from here trying to go in and like directly interact with this database, since if you have the role that each microservice like owns a single database, right? And so it's like,
Yeah.
I do feel like there's so much there's a lot more dragons, I think, in the monolith world when it comes to doing strict DDD. So it makes me wonder if microservices were just an easier way to enforce DDD conventions in some ways. Like,
yes, but I mean, at its heart, it's about interfaces, right? And like in declaring your interfaces. So like in that thing in that example, the key part of it is that because the accounts receivable code owns its own tables, it's nobody else's business how those evolve. They're free to change them at will. Whereas that table that you've declared as an interchange table, you're not free to change that at will because other people depend on it, and you have to do some sort of versioning or consensus on any changes to that.
Wow.
But you've drawn a clear distinction because no one's getting at your
yeah, that would be, I'd be like, could you just use code? Like, I mean, honestly, yeah, don't try to create a database table that's also an interface, in my opinion. Like, just use functions or classes that just do that, and then the classes can again be that anti-corruption or that facade. Like, I don't know why you have to add
not the best, but we've all had to write SSQS reports or SSRS, whatever, and that wants to interface with tables, and there's a different team maintaining them, and you're like, fine, like that's the way you would do it. Don't let them query into your data, because then you can't change it without consensus from that team, but you can generate tables specifically for them, specifically in the format they want, so they don't have to write really complex
code,
like
for analytics and things like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
We do that. Like, there are practical reasons why we do that already. It's not that wild, but it's not the preferred option. I will say that, like,
I think that's a different thing than like having it in your application. Like, I would say that's different than having it in your application for another thing to consume, like a way. Yeah, I don't know.
But like the flip side of the coin is that when you do have microservices, it's easy to start spinning to forget about the concept of bounded context entirely and start just spinning up microservices for everything. Like, all right, I'm going to have a microservice for what is a user, for like a user, right? And you go through and you're like, so really you're just spinning back IDs. Like, that didn't need its own thing. That's slowing everything down. It's building a nasty dependency tree. You don't want to
make it too easy to spin up a microservice. You want to make it somewhat painful, I think.
Right. Sure. Oh, we got 1 minute. Shit. Filled up a lot of time there.
You just decide how many network hops your application is going to have total, and then everybody's going to draw out of that pool.
Yeah. Oh, but then someone wants to do eventual consistency. and that's cool, but then you could still get 7 different hops into that. Yeah. All right. We're at the hour. Thanks, everyone. Thanks. A lot of fun. We'll talk again next week.
Very cool. Thanks, Georging, for leading it and recording it. I'm going to watch it later this afternoon.
Great. Thank you. Bye, all.
Bye, everybody.